Hello, welcome to Safety Natters, the podcast where we discuss the health and safety and wellbeing challenges facing contractors today. So this is episode 1, The Invisible Hazard, where we're going to be talking around the often overlooked mental health in the workplace. So I'm Emily from Safe Contractor. I'm joined today by Helen, who's going to bring the HR and the people perspective through SafeHR. And I'm also joined by Nick, who's going to bring the health and safety and risk perspective through SafeWorkforce. So welcome today.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
So I think just to kick us off, Nick, I suppose one of the challenges with mental health is that it isn't always visible in the same way that perhaps a physical hazard is. So why do you think mental health is now such an important workplace health and safety issue?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yes, you're right. If someone has a physical injury, they fall down the stairs, they break their leg, there's an obvious cause, there's an obvious result, but there's also an obvious treatment plan. You go to hospital, you have a cast stays on for 4 weeks, cast comes off, you rehabilitate and your leg's better. The difficulty with mental health is that there are cumulative factors. We all have stresses in our life outside of work as well as inside of work. When you look at number of lost days, we lose approximately 17 million days to mental health issues within the workplace. And if you compare that to sort of fatalities, our fatalities have dropped significantly. We're down to around about 135 fatalities a year in the UK, but that lost days figure isn't moving. So the HSE are targeting the softer side of health and safety, the invisible risks such as mental health and well-being. And they do have a protecting and people and places procedure that they launched in 2023, I think. And it's their long-term goal that's going to run to about 2030. So it is something that we all have to take an active role in trying to manage.
Yeah, so you're saying is employers are still kind of treating mental health as a little bit separate from that wider risk management, but they're now starting to kind of bring that.
Certainly, but I also think it's harder to manage. If injury, we have a roadmap that we've had for a very, very long time. You try and reduce the hazards and risks, you provide first aid cover, and you carry on with your job. The mental health and the well-being, it's harder to spot, it's harder to treat, and it's harder to support the individuals involved.
Yeah, really interesting from a risk perspective. I guess, Helen, from that HR side, it shows up in slightly different ways. So you've still got the kind of engagement, performance, but what impact can poor mental health have on employees and organisations?
Yeah, I mean, it's like Nick was saying just now, the signs are more subtle when it's a mental health condition rather than obviously a physical condition. So, when employees experience poor mental health, you might not always, see the signs immediately, and they are quite subtle, but, commonly it will affect, kind of employee engagement in ways, for example, it might even be the employee might be a bit less enthusiastic or have a little less motivation than they had previously, or you may notice that they participate less in team activities and workplace sort of events and that sort of thing. When you may see some signs that they're just actually withdrawing from the team. But then obviously in terms of performance wise, you may notice that as an employer in terms of the person has reduced productivity, or their output, or their quality of work may be declining. And so it's more about looking for the more subtle signs that start to deteriorate.
So I guess what we're saying is employers are kind of underestimating those quieter signs in the workplace.
Yeah, I think so. And because they are less obvious, when you look at sickness absence, that is measurable because it's visual, it's visible. If someone's not in the office or they're not at work, you're going to notice their absence. Whereas, with poor mental health, if you contrast that in terms of subtle changes in behaviour. It's harder to identify as a poor mental health issue rather than one that is, someone's performance is not right, or they're, a conduct issue if they're not behaving in the way that you'd expect.
Yeah. I remember when I did mental health first aid, one of the things that stayed with me was that you're not necessarily trying to act as the counsellor or trying to diagnose the problem, but more recognise the signs and being able to signpost them in the right direction for help. So what could some of the signs be that, an employee might be struggling with their mental health in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, they are quite vast, but it's more, I think, about being alert to changes in what someone's normal behaviour is. As I say, and they may be quite subtle at first, but I'd say, some common signs that someone is suffering with poor mental health, the more obvious ones, I would say, that someone may be a bit more quiet or withdrawn than they have been before, or they may be less confident or enthusiastic, than they've seemed to present as before. But also, it could be that they're more irritable or a bit more grouchy, maybe a bit more snappy, which is maybe a bit out of character for them. But then in terms of the withdrawal aspect, you could, as I said earlier, just not contributing as much, avoiding social interactions, declining, lunch invites or after work, social engagements. And then eventually, that might lead to more frequent short-term absences, or, the reverse of that is you sometimes find that people still do come to work, but they're just not present, and they're not performing or acting or behaving, in the way that you would expect them to.
Yeah. I think it's also as well, even when that support exists for the employees in the workplace, employers will find it hard to take that first step. So why do you think so many people find it difficult to ask for help with their mental health?
I think that there still is a lot of stigma around mental health and having poor mental health, and I'd say especially for men. I think there is still this, maybe it's a sign of weakness, and that people just want to feel that they have to just get on with it, and sort of not admit that they are struggling, and I think that stigma probably is one of the main reasons, especially in men, why they maybe don't, open up or tell anyone that there's a problem. Sometimes, until the problem is quite severe, and they are suffering quite badly. But also, I think there is still a fear of judgment, especially in an employer-employee context. I think there's a fear that, well, if I admit that I'm not coping or I'm struggling, am I going to lose my job, or, are people going to think less of me or think that I'm less competent in my job? So, I think those sorts of aspects do, make it quite difficult for employees to open up still.
Yeah. And Nick, this feels particularly relevant to those construction or site-based environments where people work remotely, or they're moving between sites, and they perhaps have lesser access to that HR support, or that that access to be opening up and speaking to their colleagues. Are there particular challenges in construction environments that employers should be aware of?
It's the remoteness. So if you have contractors that travelled for work to and from sites, then it is particularly important. There was a case quite recently where an employee had finished work for the day. The employer didn't check that they were okay to drive, and they were driving quite some distance home. They fell asleep behind the wheel, collided with a parked articulated lorry, and both the driver and the passenger died. The employer needs to realise that their responsibility doesn't end just because the work has stopped. If you've asked somebody to travel, you're also, work safe, home safe is a common health and safety procedure that a lot of companies employ, And the home safe is as important as the work safe.
Yeah.
People deserve to be home safely to their families and whether they have family or not. But people, we have that moral obligation to make sure people get home.
Yeah. And do you think that when incidents happen like that in the workplace, change has been brought about, or do you think there's still a lagness kind of, happening within? With
an awful lot of health and safety, I can't speak to mental health specifically, but a lot of health and safety, you do see change within companies when something horrendous happens.
Yeah.
Coca-Cola is a perfect example. There was a chap in 1990, had a very, very serious work-related injury. He was mixing cleaning chemicals. There was an explosion of the cleaning chemicals. He was about 18 inches away from it, and the explosion hit the ceiling, which was 70 foot high. Lost his sense of taste, his sense of smell, went blind, and Coke implemented a top-down regime change. But from a societal point of view, it tends to be through legislation. Yeah. It tends to be through the HSE in the health and safety key is pushing that change.
Yeah.
And it is a lag. For cultural changes, we expect 10 years. To get a positive cultural change, it takes about 10 years, which is an awful
long time. Yeah.
That is an important point actually as well, isn't it, what you're saying about cultural changes, because, really these things do have to be led by management and, be fed down from the top. And that's really, really important.
Yeah, and definitely. And I guess, psychological safety is one of those phrases that we keep hearing a lot now. But for some people, some managers, some companies, it may seem quite abstract. So, Helen, what do you think a psychological safety can actually look like in practice?
I think for me, it's really about sort of fostering this culture of, open communication. So, and I really do think this is key to, workplace mental health and having this supportive culture. And I do think that if a lot more, organisations were able to put this in place, I think we would see a difference. So what I mean when I say open communication, it's really just, making sure that your staff are really comfortable about being able to, open up. So, they're able to share ideas, they're able to come to you if there's a problem, raise concerns about their workload if, they are struggling, ask questions, and also like being able to feel comfortable coming to you if they've made a mistake, because we are all human at the end of the day, and even challenging decisions, because, and it's just really important that you have a workplace where your staff feel comfortable to do that without fear that they are going to be any negative consequences or that they're going to be ridiculed or,
exactly.
Even sort of disciplined, for doing those things.
And it is usually the manager that would first start noticing those problems. And, they're not expected to be, counsellors, but they do have a part to play in kind of creating that environment where their employers feel kind of open to, having those conversations. But I guess, are there kind of helpful ways that managers can begin conversations without kind of making assumptions?
I think, in fact, I think it's one of the things that people do struggle most with, because I suppose, it can feel quite daunting or it can feel a bit awkward. But what I would say is, before you get to any of those stages, just try and have normal conversations, just try and have regular conversations, because then when you, perhaps do have to talk about something like an employee's mental health, it won't feel so awkward if you're already having, kind of these regular conversations with them. And again, it's not rocket science, or, don't worry about, I'm going to say the wrong thing, or I'm not going to get that term right, or, it's really just, just trying to have as far as possible, a normal sort of chat. How are you chat, it's just to try and open up that conversation. But if you're doing that regularly, it doesn't look or feel so bad, if you have to maybe then talk about something a bit more serious.
Definitely. And I guess for smaller companies, mental health can feel like this huge topic. You know, where do they start? Do they start with putting policies in place? Do they, have people to do mental health first aid courses? So what kind of first ways can a smaller business start to strengthen their health and safety within the workplace?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And again, it can feel daunting. I would say have a well-drafted policy, because it's always good for you to refer back to, but also for employees to, refer to. But what I would say more importantly is, don't just have a policy and then just, leave it sitting in the staff handbook and never look at it. The most important thing about having a policy is you really do have to live and breathe it. And I know that sounds a bit corny, but, do look at it, and look at it quite a lot, and do ask your employees to look at it, and then talk about it, together, as a business, as a team, one-to-ones, and just use that, as a tool to have these conversations. Because it's no point having a load of written policies that no one ever looks at. It's more about what happens on a day-to-day basis and what you do in practice that really counts. A policy is good, but obviously make sure that you are doing things to look at it. But there are some other things, that are really, really, good to have. So a lot of organisations will have employee assistance programs, EAPs, I would call them for short, but they are normally provided by, an outside third party, but provide, counselling, 24-hour counselling hotlines, that sort of thing, at a relatively low cost, so they are really good tools to be able to offer, your staff, so they can have confidential chats if they are struggling at work. But really a combination of all those things, together with the most important thing, I think, about having the open conversations.
Yeah. So we talked a lot, Helen's talked a lot about the kind of people-focused side of this, but I guess from a health and safety responsibility to recognise that those work-related stresses and those risks, how does that stress management fit into an employer's wider responsibilities when we talk at it from a health and safety perspective?
Yeah, we have a primary legislation that most people are aware of, which is the Health and Safety at Work Act. And it says that employers have a legal obligation to keep employees safe. From that, we have our secondary legislation, which is our management regs. And that's the one that requires risk assessment. And it doesn't specify. It says that you have to risk assess activities that are hazardous. It doesn't say that potentially can break your leg, that may kill you. It's all hazards, and mental health is a hazard, and people's well-being, has to be protected. So it falls under the management regs, which requires people to carry that out. To help employers, the HSE do produce their stress management standards. There are 6 of them. They're freely available on the HSE's website, and it does allow employers, whether they're very small companies or multi-million pound, hundreds of staff, it does allow you to think in the right direction, and look at things like demands on the workforce change. All companies grow and expand, or are we allowed to talk about COVID yet? Is it long ago? But when we look at COVID, that was a huge mental health crisis for the entire population. And we all went through a huge amount of change. I was unfortunate enough to work all the way through COVID. I was classed as an essential worker for some reason. And it was great for me because the motorways were empty. It was wonderful. My commute was amazing. But a lot of people were locked up in their homes for extended periods of time. And it's that change in patterns. And if you're an indoor cat, you might like being in your house for weeks on end, but there are people out there who like to interact with other people and socialise. So the HSE do recognise that it's an issue. They recognise that it's a difficult issue. So they do provide those support. And as Helen's already mentioned, finding, we all have our specialities, and we all have our what we're good at. and somebody who is an electrician is very good at being an electrician.
Yeah.
They may not be great at HR. They might not be great at health and safety. So reaching out to other companies for that support, and find so they can tell you, knowing what you don't know is very, very powerful. So I'm not an HR specialist. Yeah. And therefore I reach out to an HR company and say, help me with HR. Mm-hmm. And it is important to
it's interesting though, because I guess, the impact of COVID and working remotely has actually shone a light of the negative impact that, working off grid or working remotely can have on someone's mental health and well-being. And, you talked a lot about the cultural, the practical support, but there's also a massive, legal side. It's not nice to have mental health anymore. So what are the kind of legal considerations that employers should be taking with some of the mental health conditions?
It can be quite serious, and it does deserve the attention that we're giving it. Nick's already talked about, from the health and safety angle, obviously from a health and safety angle, employers do have a duty of care, and that extends to those provisions that Nick just mentioned. But also, importantly in this field is the Equality Act in 2010. And under that Act, a mental health condition, as well as a physical condition, can be classed as a disability, which from that gives the employee protection from discrimination. But more importantly, when we're looking at this, it triggers a duty on employers to look at making what we call reasonable adjustments. So reasonable adjustments are changes that an employer can make to remove or reduce the disadvantage that some employees with a disability will have in the workplace. And there are lots and lots of examples of what a reasonable adjustment could look like. It's not sort of a black and white list, but I suppose when we're talking about someone with poor mental health, it could be adjustments such as reducing someone's hours, on a temporary or permanent basis, maybe having a bit of flexibility around start times or their finish times. It could be, allowing someone to have some time off to go to some counselling or that sort of thing. But what's really important about the duty is that it's a positive duty. So as the employer, you shouldn't sort of sit back and wait for the employee to come to you. You should be actively, looking at this and thinking, what can we do to help someone so that they can, sort of be on a sort of same level playing field as people that aren't suffering with that disability. In extreme circumstances, if an employee, does have a very serious mental health condition caused by, in some way through work or the workplace, they can bring a personal injury claim as well. But those are sort of the more serious cases. Yeah. But in all of these potential legal claims, the compensation, for example, under the Equality Act, if someone brings a discrimination claim, the compensation is unlimited potentially. So, good financial reasons as well why employers need to be looking at this. Yeah,
and then I guess, Nick, for when employers don't take this seriously, as Helen mentioned, kind of losing the trust of the workplace or even HSE scrutiny, like what are the risks of workplaces not taking this seriously?
They're quite significant. The HSE can attend site if they find a breach, and that might be from a legislative point of view, or they notice that the employer is not fulfilling their legal obligations. Their current rate is £188 an hour. So the moment they notice something is not right, they're charging you £188 an hour for their time. That is unlimited as well. The average, when it was a little lower, was around about £7,000. That's uninsurable. That has to go out of turnover. And then if they decide to prosecute, the HSE have a 94% conviction rate. which is unbelievably high.
Yeah, it's really high.
There are new sort of sentencing guidelines.
Mm-hmm.
I say new. Everything since COVID is new, isn't it? They've been around a while, but there are guidelines for prosecuting for now on fines. They look at the size of the business, the severity of the injury, and the likelihood of it happening again. Coming back to the example that I quoted earlier about the two chaps who were travelling home, the company was fined £450,000 with £300,000 costs.
And there could be, so damaging that it could close a businse. Those type of costs.
Again, that's uninsurable. That's a fine.
Mm-hmm.
So it's you're insured against. We have employers' liability insurance. We have public liability insurance. HSE's costs and HSE's fines are uninsurable. The company has to find that money. HMRC then steps in and says you're now no longer profitable, and they put a winding up order in place, and you're out of business. So it is significant, and it does happen.
Yeah. So to finish, I'm just going to ask you both just for one practical takeaway. So if an employer was just to do one thing this month to improve employee wellbeing in their workplace, what would it be? And I'll start with Helen.
I would say just have a meaningful conversation with every person in your team, or in your company if you're a smaller company. Just one conversation where you just have a chat and ask them, how they are, and if there's anything that you can do or anything they need from you, to support them.
Yeah, don't underestimate the power of conversation.
Underestimate the power of that.
Yeah. And Nick, I'll just go to you, but from that health and safety perspective.
Actually, reinforce what Helen said earlier. There's a phrase that's been coined, which is mental health washing. And it's about, yes, we have a policy. We've trained mental health first aiders. We now no longer have a problem. You need to integrate your systems into your operation. It's not a document that sits on the shelf.
Yeah.
You need to make sure that people are aware and it's integrated and it's used and it's a living, breathing thing, essentially.
Yeah. Thank you both. I think the key takeaway is that employers and companies don't need the answer straight away. They just need to be creating those conditions for people to feel comfortable to speak up, really.
Yeah.
So Helen and Nick, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.